Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini. I post weekly videos right here on my YouTube channel, and in this video, we're gonna have a little chat. We're talking garment sewing versus quilting. Now, because I'm someone who sews both garments and quilts, I kind of get stuck in the middle of this conversation. And over the past 10 years or so of teaching both garment sewing and quilting, I find that there are these three things that I so often hear both people who sew garments say about quilters and quilters say about those of us who sew garments. Because I'm in the middle, I think I have a unique perspective because I'm able to look at the conversation from both sides. So I definitely want to hear your input and see what you think about this. But let's jump into those three things that I'm talking about. So as an instructor, I often get students who want to learn how to do one or the other, right? Sew garments or make quilts. Now, one of the things, I would say number one thing that I often hear people say is that it's harder. And they say it's harder about the other craft that they don't do. So if they sew clothes, they'll say, oh, I can't get into quilting because quilting is a lot harder, right? And I hear quilters say the same thing like, oh no, I make quilts because it's easier. Making clothes is way too hard. And it's so funny to me because anything new that we try to jump into and tackle and learn, of course it's going to be a little bit harder, right? Unless you have this natural knack for it, it's going to be hard because you don't know how to do it. So it takes trial and error, practice, some good instruction from people, good resource guides and books and things like that. And it's just like anything else that we all learn how to do in life, right? It takes time, practice, and some type of a commitment. Now, the second thing I often hear both parties say is that they don't do the other thing because it requires too much precision. And this is hilarious to me because as a quilter, I got into quilting because of the precision. I loved having to have super precise cuts. It just like feeds the type A personality and perfectionist in me, having everything nice, clean, crisp edges, making those seams match, all the intersections match perfectly. That's actually why I got into quilting, because I enjoyed that part of it and I was basically striving to make these perfect projects. Since I started to now, I've come a long way to where I'm not that much of a perfectionist anymore. And I actually enjoy the process of creating, designing, and putting the whole quilt together a little bit more. But I often hear both sides say that the other one requires more precision. And I will tell you, for someone who makes both garments and quilting, I will say that the quilters win this one. Quilting does, I mean, if you're going for a perfect quilt or you're aiming for a show type of quilt, it's going to require more precision in my experience and in my in what I have created. I think it does require a little bit more precision than garment sewing. I find that garment sewers or sewists, whatever the word you want to use, or seamstresses, there's almost more wiggle room in there for some reason. I guess, and we're not talking about super couture stuff and very tailored things. I'm talking about your everyday clothes that anybody who wants to learn how to make their clothes can make, right? I find that there's so much more wiggle room. You have these massive seam allowances and you can get away with a little bit more, right? In quilting, a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance is not that much room to work with. So if it's off by a little bit, then you have maybe 70 seams across the width of a quilt, and every little bit that you're either under or over in your seam allowance, it starts to compound across every seam, across the finished size of the quilt. Now, that doesn't mean that at the end when you put the quilt top together, it's ruined or it doesn't look good. It just might not measure the exact size that the designer of that pattern designed the quilt to be. But the design will still be there and it'll still look plenty fine, right? So I will say that in quilting, because I think of the seam allowance, it does require some more precision. And of course, there are quilts that you don't really have to be that precise with. It also has a lot to do with the design of the quilt that you're working on, okay? In garment sewing, I feel like there's just more wiggle room. Let me know what you think in the comments below. What do you think? Does quilting require more precision or does garment sewing? Now, on the side of the garment sewers, they say, oh, quilting requires too much precision. Again, it goes back to the design that you're working on and what techniques you're using. There are great beginner quilts. My kids are 5 and 7 and they make quilts. Obviously, it can't require that much precision if you have a 5-year-old. My son made a quilt when he was 3. It can't require that much precision that a 3-year-old can do it. So really, it comes down to the design and the techniques that are being used. But you can make a quilt, just a whole cloth quilt, meaning one chunk of fabric, and just quilt it or hand tie it, and that's a quilt, okay? So In the more intermediate to advanced level, I would say, of each craft, I would say that quilting may require more precision. But those of you out there that maybe work on a lot more things like fitted and tailored garments and things, you might think, well, you know what, these projects take a lot more time, or they require this expertise of hand sewing incorporated in it, and that might, in your eyes, be more precision than in quilting. So I think that one is probably more like a toss-up. But let me know what you think about that in the comments below. Now let's get to number 3. Now the third thing that I hear both parties say about each other is that they can't get into that craft because it takes way too long to complete a project, right? So as quilters, it's so funny for me to hear quilters say that, oh, I can't make a shirt or a dress because it takes so long. And I feel like it's like a mental block that we have when you think about, oh, I have to take out the pattern. I have to cut the pattern, the tissue pattern out. If it's a multi-size pattern, I have to cut out my size. I have to fit it. I have to make any adjustments that I might need for my body so that the pattern fits. I have to pre-wash my fabric. I have to cut it out on grain. And there's like all these steps of things that you need to do that help you end up with more successful results in garment sewing, right? But it's funny because we have the exact same type of prep work that's intensive, kind of like that. You know, it takes time and it takes effort, and you need to do these things before you can jump into cutting and piecing your quilt top together. So I feel like it's almost a mental block. It's like we tell ourselves as quilters, oh my gosh, garment sewing has so many different steps before you even get to the sewing part. And I find that in garment sewing, that tends to be true. It's like there's way more prep work than the actual sewing. Because if you think about it, to make a t-shirt, I mean, if you're making something like this little top where it's just like a dolman style sleeve, you really only have the front and the back of it. And that's really kind of like your most basic t-shirt pattern that you could try out there, where you're not setting in any sleeves. And then you have a neckband. So it's like a seam here, a seam here, a seam here, a seam here, and then you sew on the neckband. Let's assume that we're not hemming it. But if you wanted to, you would just, hem the sleeves and the bottom of the shirt. But I mean, that's less than 10 seams. In quilting, it's very common for you to have 10 or more seams in just one quilt block. So for garment sewing, I feel like the prep work, the pre-washing, the fitting, the cutting out the fabric and the pattern and all that stuff takes a lot more time than the actual sewing. Because when you're sewing, front to back, it's only 2 seams. In quilting, we have a lot more sewing. And again, it's going to always come back to the design. You can have a very simple quilt design that doesn't require that much piecing. Or you can have one that's like 72 chunks of fabric or seams per block, which is insane, but I've had to do those before. Now, prep work aside, let's talk about the actual saying that they say, that it takes too long to complete a project. Granted, there are plenty of quilts out there that can easily take you 6 months to a year to complete. Personally, I consider myself a quilter, and I am a published pattern designer, a fabric designer, and I would say that I'm a professional quilter, right? I don't work on those quilts. If a quilt is going to take me 6 months to make, I'm not designing it, and I'm probably not making it. Not because I don't want to, but just because I don't have the time, right? I like quick projects that I can crank out. And I am quite fast at cutting and sewing, so I personally can make a quilt in a day. There are easily garments that will take you more than a day to make. Okay, so a lot of people that make clothes, they don't think, there's no way you can make a quilt in a day, but I've made several quilts in one day. I think it's just more of where your mindset is and what you enjoy to do, right? Whatever we enjoy to do, we don't care how intricate it is, how long it takes. If we're enjoying the entire journey, right, the process of creating, I feel like we enjoy every single step of the way versus thinking as an outsider like, oh, this is going to take way too long to make. So I don't think that that's necessarily true, that one takes more time than the other. Of course, if you're working on a couture wedding gown that has to be all hand sewn and you're like hand beating sequins onto something, that's going to take a lot longer, Or if on quilting, if you're hand piecing it or hand quilting a queen size quilt, it's going to take you a lot longer than my 1-day quilts, okay? So again, it just depends where your interest is and really what your lifestyle is like and what you're allowed or what you can allow and make room for to fit in terms of the complexity of the project. So if you're someone who sews clothes and you've maybe always wanted to create a quilt, don't block it off completely. Remember and maybe go back to some of the garments that you've sewn and ask yourself, how long did it take you? How hard did you think it was? And how much precision did it actually require? You might find it interesting that there are plenty of quilting projects that you can totally tackle. I am a firm believer that if you know how to use a sewing machine, how to use basic things that you need like pins and iron and either scissors or a rotary cutter, and you know how to sew straight, you can make a quilt. So if that somebody is you, definitely don't exit out completely. Try giving quilting a try. And of course, I have hundreds of tutorials right here on my YouTube channel that you can try out. Now, if you're a quilter and you think, I can never find clothes that fit me, or you just struggle finding things that are comfortable for you to wear and have always thought, oh, how amazing would it be for me to be able to make my own clothes, and you think that you can't give it a go because it requires too much precision in your eyes, or it's so much harder than quilting, or maybe you think it's just gonna take you too long to where it's not really worth it, right? For you to put in the time, the effort, and the money to learn how to make your own clothes. I would say give it a try. There's so many really simple patterns and projects out there that you can try, and I hope that all of you will stick around and watch some of my future tutorials that are in the works, where I'm gonna help kind of walk you through all those little struggles. And because I'm a quilter and I can sew garments, I'm going to try and use my teaching style to kind of reach out to those of you that may be new to this side of sewing. So if maybe you're a quilter, I'll try to speak to you when I do the garment sewing tutorials. And if you sew garments, I'll try to speak a little bit more to you when I'm doing my quilting tutorials, all right? So we can all help each other out. I would love it if you left me a comment below and let me know your thoughts on these things, and maybe if you're one of those people out there that has thought the same thing about either sewing or quilting. Leave me a comment below, and if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit it with the thumbs up below. Share it across the different social media sites, and don't forget to click the subscribe button. That would be awesome so you don't miss out on my future videos. There's also a little bell next to the subscribe button, and you definitely want to click on that. And what that does is it actually enables the notification so that they notify you every time a new video goes up. Instead of just getting like these weekly digests and things, I find that a lot of you often miss the new tutorials that go up. So click the subscribe button, hit the little bell so you'll be notified at every single time I upload a brand new tutorial, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.